right, as people are entering the room now, I just like to welcome you along. My name is Rosemary Hayden, your chair for the evening for the event, this IWLA webinar on the topic of our Article 41.2. Just to give you a little bit of a starting kind of, we'll start with the boring, housekeeping-y stuff. We're delighted to have you all join us here tonight. We've had a wonderful sign up, 225 people signing up, so people will be joining us obviously as we go in through the evening. We have attendees from all over the country, indicating a great interest in this topic, and obviously as well as the great draw of our guest speaker, Dr. Mary McAuliffe here tonight. A few little housekeeping matters. First of all, we'll have everyone muted as default as you come in. Your videos, you can absolutely leave your video on should you wish. When our speaker, our guest speaker, Dr. McAuliffe is speaking, it will be spotlighted to her and to her slides, and that portion of the event is going to be recorded then for later dissemination, and we'll be showing you where you'll be able to access that recording as well. I'm here in my position as Honorary Secretary of the Irish Women Lawyers Association, as well as a member of the RTB 41.2 subgroup. And we have a few different items that we have had, well, more than a few actually. This project has really grown legs. We have been working on this project for a number of years now. And we've started off by having an academic research paper published on the matter by my colleague Anne Conlon, who you'll be hearing more from this evening in dealing with our conversation, our Q&A. We have had the papers published. We have had academic papers published. We have had a number of sessions, webinars, as well as in-person training regarding this topic, and all of that is available via our iwla.ie website under projects, and also on our YouTube channel, which you can again access via our website. Our book time on the event is 1 hour, but what we found is that particularly on topics like this where we have people's interest, we often find that people want to keep talking about it. So what we'll do is we'll call time on the hour, but then anyone else who wants to stay on and continue the chat, you're more than welcome to do so. Another thing is that our Q&A will not be recorded, only Dr. McAuliffe's talk will actually be recorded. So the presentation section of the event being recorded, the recording then will be available afterwards. The recording is obviously spotlighting the speaker, and so don't worry if your video is still on. That's not going to be an issue. So to give a little bit of the background on the project, the subgroup was formed by the Irish Women Lawyers Association to look into the provisions of Article 41.2, which you may know as the woman place in the home provision, which is, a peculiar sort of one to start off with on name alone. So we commissioned the research with Anne Conlon, and you'll access that also through our section on projects on the IWLA website. We have academic articles published in the Law Society Gazette and elsewhere. We've contributed submissions to the Citizens Assembly regarding issues of gender and gender balance, and a number of seminars run on the topic. All of these resources available to you. Now, the topic has clearly gained momentum and has gained interest, and clearly it's tipping into a zeitgeist moment at the moment regarding how we view home, how we view gender, how we view work, and all of those things combining into the big maelstrom of the current great unpleasantness that we're all living through. So a little bit to introduce our guest speaker, and we're absolutely delighted and honoured to have with us here tonight Dr. Mary McAuliffe. You may recognise her from recently the RTE documentary War and Women on Fiji Cahir, and which I think a lot of people found, myself included, found very arresting viewing. Dr. McAuliffe is Assistant Professor of Gender Studies at UCD and holds her PhD from Trinity. Published widely, including a biography of Margaret Skinner, and currently working on a book entitled Kilkenny and the Revolution for the Four Courts Press, the Irish Revolution. So as a UCD history grad myself, I am absolutely delighted and honoured to have the great pleasure of handing over at this point to our guest speaker for the evening, Dr. Mary McAuliffe. Dr. McAuliffe, many thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and it's great to be here. And if you don't mind, I'll share the screen. Have I done that? Oh, I have, yes. For the moment, and I'm delighted to be able to come and join you all to talk about this evening. It's something that's very close to my heart in many ways, although at the moment most of my research is on the revolutionary period and following on from that War and Women documentary. I'm diving deep into the gendered and sexualized violence against women by both sides during the revolutionary period, but it actually links into this, as does all experiences of women. And what I'm finding is an awful lot, in fact, the majority of the violence committed against women, particularly the forcible haircutting of young women, was done by the IRA in order to make proper Irish women of them, because they were dating RIC men or black and tans, or were presumed to be misbehaving in some way contrary to the moral and purity codes of the period. And of course, we see this continue on into the Irish Free State. And in a way, that's saying that the 37 Constitution, what happened in the decades before it, the first 2 decades of the Free State, didn't come out of nowhere. It was already there, even in that moment of revolution, that moment of radical promise that so many of the women had felt, particularly after the promises of equality in the proclamation of 1916. And basically, that's where I'm doing my talk from, or that platform this evening. I'm not really going on after 37. What I am very interested in is why these articles got to be in the Constitution, particularly as we already had one Constitution in 1922 that was gender neutral, really, and reiterated the promises of equality for women that had been in the proclamation. So this promise of equality of 1916, reiterated in 1922, was, as the historian Maria Luddy writes, a benchmark by which various women's groups measured the performance of various governments with regard to women's rights, but was a standard rarely met by any government of the period. And what that promise was, and of course the thing is in my way, this is the problems with Zoom. 1916 proclamation: the Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. And later on in that document, it guarantees equal suffrage to men and women, that the imagined republic would be elected, the politicians in that republic would be elected by suffrage of all men and women equally. And this is probably the most radical promise in the proclamation of 1916. The other promises about land, about property ownership, about workers' rights had been part of other proclamations through the 18th and 19th century, inspired by the French Revolution, American Revolution, etc., etc. But this promise to women specifically of equal rights and equal opportunities was a radical promise and a radical break, and is, I think, one of the first, from memory, is one of the first outside of Russia that guarantees that. And indeed, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington says that. She said in 1917, equal citizenship to women, beating, as she noted, was proud to note, all records except that of the Russian Revolution. It then is written into Article 3 of the 1922 Constitution. Every person without distinction of sex, domiciled in the area of the jurisdiction of the Irish Free State, etc., shall enjoy the privileges and be subject to the obligations of such citizenship. And really that echoes what had been the masthead of the Irish Citizen newspaper: the rights of citizenship for all and the duties of citizenship for all. So without distinction of sex, Article 3 of the Constitution amplifies the guarantee of that equal status that was written into the 1916 proclamation. And it's good to remember that, because for these women, this was the promise they were really fighting for. However, this promise of equal citizenship for women, which formed the part of the 22 Constitution, was rarely met. And as I said, Maria Luddy said, it was a standard rarely met by groups going forward from 1922. The anti-women legislation introduced through the 1920s and into the 1930s can be understood in several ways. Firstly, it can be seen as a response to the fact that many politicised Irish women, especially the women in Cumann na mBan, had rejected the 1922 Anglo-Irish Treaty and were considered to be anti-government. Statements in the First Dáil also revealed a real lack of acceptance of female participation in the public realm of work and politics. And the Oireachtas debates are such a rich resource for these statements. In fact, some of them would make you laugh with their attitudes towards women. Well, laugh in a very ironic and bitter way in many ways. And they are online. And if you're a nerdy like me, you do enjoy going through them and reading them. So the participation of women in the workplace was seen as both an injury to women because it unsexed them or it defeminized them, and to the political era itself. It was felt by some that the presence of women brought a bitterness and hysteria and an emotionalism which had no place in a civilized, rational, public male debate. And indeed, because Cumann na mBan had been, for the most part, anti-treaty, that bitterness is carried through in the attitudes of several of the leaders of the Cumann na Gael government in the Irish Free State about women. Cosgrave, for example, said that these women, these militant women, these political women, were diehards whose ecstasies at their extremists can find no outlet so satisfying as destruction. These furies, as they were also called, influenced weak men and children to follow the path of violence and death. They were the underlying cause of the Civil War. P.S. O'Hegarty as well called them hysterical women. And he said women's business in the world is with the things of life, again going to the idea of motherhood. But these women busied themselves with nothing but the things of death. Militant women, this army of women, whose activities were once necessary for the fight and to win the war, were now seen as dangerous, evil, unmanageable subversives or unmanageable revolutionaries, as they were also called. And without reimposing control over these women, they had the potential to destroy society and the Irish nation. That's how dangerous it is. And I've seen one headline in one of the Irish newspapers around the mid-1920s that said, you know, the big headline was "The New Terror." And the new terror were women, vocal women, public women. And there was a growing concern about armed women and girls, which was reflected in a Free State report that said neurotic girls are the most active adherents to the irregular or anti-treaty cause. However, that wasn't the only reason why we see this chipping away at that promise, that radical promise of equality, almost immediately that the Irish Free State set up. Secondly, it was social conservatism, which can broadly be understood as a response to the chaos of the War of Independence and the bitter conflicts of the Civil War, and an attempt to restore a traditional order and hierarchy that impacted on women's position within the Free State as well. The first 2 decades of the 20th century had seen women emerge in greater numbers from the domestic sphere and participate in the hitherto male-dominated spheres of Irish politics. For many of these women, influenced by the ideologies of feminism and nationalism, the expectation was that a free Ireland would guarantee them full and equal citizenship, and they'd been promised that. However, the new state felt that the contribution of women would be most acceptable within the domestic sphere. The ideal Irish woman was above all a wife and a mother. The home and the heart was to be her sphere of influence. And women in their specific role as biological reproducers became the natural symbols of continuity of a national culture and identity. The new state viewed women, as Marianne Valulis says, as rooted in the private sphere and directly related to motherhood within marriage. And that's very important, as we know, as our society and our state take a reckoning with what happened to those women who became pregnant outside of marriage and how they were treated within this state, because the construct of Irish women was very, very narrow. To be that moral and pure and respectable Irish woman, it was marriage, motherhood, and the domestic in that order. So this development reflected the growing influence of the Catholic Church with its sermons and literature throughout the 1920s. It railed against the moral deterioration of the world in general and Irish women in particular. For example, Edward Cahill SJ, whom I'll mention again later on, wrote in 1925 that granting the vote to women had been an error, which had been inconsistent with the Christian ideal of the intimate union between husband and wife, that they could exercise the political franchise as distinct units, leading to disputes in the home about the political issues, and which would bring disharmony to the domestic sphere and undermine the duty of care a woman owed to her husband and family. With the right to vote came the rights of duty and duties of citizenship, which might distract the ideal woman from her domestic duties. This positioning of women in the home was, according to church literature, and I think this is the next one though, according to church literature, to serve as a moral cornerstone of the new Catholic nation. And remember De Valera's Catholic nation for a Catholic people, without which the nation would and could not develop. Furthermore, this discourse dictated that the moral purity of the ideal Irish woman was essential for the well-being of the Irish family and the Irish nation. Therefore, female morality had to be regulated by church and state and enforced and preserved at all costs. So by 1922, most Irish women had the vote, and many legal barriers to full citizenship had been removed. However, from the very beginning of the Irish Free State, there was a concentrated effort to block women's continued advance into the public arena. Indeed, as many historians of Irish women's political and social history have shown, not only were attempts made to stop further advances for women, there was also a backlash, and some serious legislative attempts were made to undermine rights already gained. The decade 1922 to 32 would see the stabilising of democratic principles of government under a Cumann Gael government, which is to their credit, but it would also see the constant chipping away at the civil rights of women and the promotion of a dominant discourse of women in the home and private sphere, where the right to work outside the home, the right to control fertility and reproduction, the right to self-determine female sexuality and access to political power by women was regulated and restricted. One of the first pieces of gendered legislation, which would be of interest to you as an organisation, introduced was the 1924 Juries Bill, which would allow women to opt out of serving on juries. So women were still to serve on juries, but they could opt out of it in that, serving on juries wasn't really seen as the right thing for women to do. This was alarming to feminist activists who viewed it as a retrograde step in their campaign for full and equal citizenship. The Irish Women's Citizens and Local Government Association pointed out that this legislation was, and I quote, unfair to the men citizens and derogatory to the women. Other pieces of legislation that continued on, and you can see a whole load of them here, included the 1925 Civil Service Amendment Act that gave the government the power to ban women from certain civil service exams. This act effectively was an attempt to bar women from the higher ranks of the civil service, and some would argue we're still dealing with that almost 100 years later, that it's only now we're beginning to see women actually get into those senior positions, because there was a culture of not having women in senior positions from the very beginning of the state. Then came the 1927's Juries Bill, which was another attempt to deny women the right to sit on juries altogether. This, I think you would enjoy this quotation from Senator Barrington, a man in the Dáil on the Juries Bill in 1927. Women have a great many private duties to perform. They have to look after their houses, and in many cases have to cook their husband's dinner and look after the children. Why these women should be taken away from these duties, which are essential to the welfare of the state, to serve on juries which they hate, I don't know how I knew that, and simply at the beginning of the bidding of a few prominent women, again here the discourse of demonizing public women, who are engaged on the militant side of the question, is more than I can see. So the 1927 Juries Act makes it very, very difficult for women to sit on juries. Then we have the 1929 Censorship of Publication Act, which banned advertising and contraception, and on and on. So it's an attack on women's place in the workplace, and it's attack on women's place exercising citizenship duties, and it's attack on women's control over their own bodies. After a period of abstention, Fianna Fáil then enters the Oireachtas in 1927. By 1932, it constituted the largest political party, and with the Labour government was able to form a government in that year at the election. And it is to the credit of all these parties. I know I'm giving out about them in their attitude to women, but it is a credit actually in light of what we've seen in the last week or so in America, for example, that there was a relatively peaceful transfer of power from the two Civil War enemies, from Cumann na Gael, who now then go on to form Fine Gael, to Fianna Fáil, and they were bitter enemies. However, while they might have been doing good by democracy, they certainly weren't doing good by women. And if women had any hope of expectations of change, they were soon disabused. Soon after the new government took power, Senator Kathleen Clark remarked that things which they, Fianna Fáil, condemned as wrong for W.T. Cosgrave's government to do become right for them to do. Clark was correct. Fianna Fáil continued what the first Irish Free State governments had begun, and they introduced more anti-women legislation, including the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1935 and the 1936 Conditions of Employment Act. And here you can see what Hannah Sheehy Skeffington had to say when De Valera comes into power. She had no belief in De Valera, well-meaning of course, better than Cosgrave, but really essentially conservative and church-bound, anti-feminist, bourgeois, and the like. So that's really, as they would say in modern parlance, was a burn by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington on Eamon de Valera. In the Conditions of Employment Act, the Act allowed any Minister for Industry to preclude women working in any industry of his choosing. Senator Clark, who of course herself was a founder member of Cumann na Món and the widow of a signatory of the proclamation, Tom Clark, said the 1916 proclamation gave to every citizen equal rights and equal opportunities. And it seems to me that if you legislate against one section of the community, if you're going to curtail them in any way they are to earn their living, where are the equal opportunities provided in that proclamation? And again, they go back to 1916. Interestingly enough, not 1922, not the Constitution, which had amplified the guarantee of equality in the proclamation. They go back to the proclamation because I think that impacted them at that time, Easter 1916, where they were given that promise of equality. As I've shown, and again I show you this is only a select list of all the different anti-women legislation. Between 22 and 36, Irish governments introduced legislation to constantly chip away at the equal position of women. During this period, women lost the right to work, to protection for female workers, to information on contraceptives, to sit on juries. The right to be a full citizen was already denied to women by the time, even before the 1937 Constitution came to be written. So basically what I'm saying here is the Constitution does not come out of nowhere. It's not invented out of De Valera's head or John Charles McQuaid or any of the others who are supposed to have had input into the Constitution. It is actually a response to what's already happening from 1922 onwards. Organisations like the Irish Women's Citizens and Local Government Association, the Irish Women's Workers Union, the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers, the National Council of Women, the National University of Women Graduates Association, the Irish Country Women's Association, had all old Cumann na Món and many individual activists who had been involved in suffrage from the early part of the century, involved in campaigns for women workers, involved in the revolutionary period themselves, fought these developments tooth and nail. And they did sometimes achieve limited gains in rolling back gendered legislation, but they were fighting against a headwind, and most of the time they didn't actually win. So this fight back then continues on into the 1937 Constitution. And it was emblematic of the anger felt by Irish women activists like Senator Kathleen Clark, widow of Tom Clark, as I said, who issued a fiery denunciation of the Constitution. Now, there were several articles that they were upset about, but I'll concentrate on the women in the home articles. And of course, you can see them there. In particular, the state recognises by her life within the home, woman gives to the state support without which the common good cannot be achieved. And this is reflective of those arguments that a pure woman, a respectable Irish woman, was necessary for the advancement of the family, advancement of the nation. So the nation needs these women in the home, not just anyone. It's the nation, the state. The state shall then therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers, and notice the change from woman and mother. Woman and mother are interchangeable here, because all women will become mothers if they don't become nuns. This is the ideology that's underpinning these sort of pieces of legislation and ultimately the Constitution. That mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect, and I emphasise that, the neglect of their duties in the home. In his magisterial study, 3-volume study of De Valera, David McCullough has suggested that, and I quote, the intellectual inspiration of the women in the home articles came from Catholic social teaching, and I would agree with that. The 1891 papal encyclical, and forget my Latin, Rerum Novarum, stated that a woman is by nature fitted for home work. And the two priests who advised De Valera on the Constitution, John Charles McQuaid, who is very well known, and our old friend that I quoted earlier on, Edward Cahill, SJ, both suggested wording to reflect this belief. As McCullough further noticed, McQuaid's wording came closest to what became Article 41.2.1, which reads, the state recognises by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. He adds, De Valera also added a clause that hadn't been suggested either by Cahill and McQuaid, and that's Article 41.2.2 about mothers and economic necessity and neglect of duties in their home. So it is these men who are deciding, based on Catholic social thinking, on conservatism, and on a necessity of constructing an idealised Irish woman in marriage, motherhood and domestic, who write these articles. In early May 1937, a draft of the proposed constitution written by these men was finally published. And now I will look at what the women had to say about this. And you can imagine from what they were already saying about the pieces of gendered legislation that had been there introduced from 22 to 36, they were not happy. The Constitution proposed 5 articles that would prove particularly objectionable to women's groups. Articles 9 and 16, intended as reiterations of the citizenship rights outlined in the 1916 proclamation, and the 22 Constitution no longer contained the without distinction of sex caveat. However, that was an easy enough fix. De Valera had explained that these were deleted because it was obvious women had the right to vote anyway. That was not going to be taken away, and it was widely accepted by our society that women had the right to vote. But in the light of feminist objections, he put them back in. So that was an easy fix. But Articles 41 and 45 proved more contentious. The draft constitution heightened women's fears, as if they weren't high enough already, about their political position in Ireland, which had already been undermined since 22, as I outlined. And here was an article from Gertrude Gaffney in the Irish Independent in May 1937. She said that this was the death knell of the working woman. Mr. De Valera has always been a reactionary where women are concerned. He dislikes and distrusts us as a sex, and his aim ever since he came into office has been to put us in what he considers is our place and keep us there. She further said, we are no longer citizens entitled to enjoy equal rights under a democratic constitution, but laws are to be enacted that will take into consideration our differences of capacity, physical and moral, and of social function. And again, from what I've been saying, this is just a reflection back. There was already the ideologies of the state and the church that were underpinning the construct of the idealized Irish woman. The feminists did fight back. The first 2 feminist organizations that sought changes to the draft constitution were the National Universities Graduates Association and the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers, which was made up of representations from many women's organizations, including the Irish Women Workers' Union. Women activists who were involved in these organisations included Hannah She Skeffington, Nora Connolly, Margaret Skinner, Dorothy McCardle, Kathleen Lynn, Madeleine French-Mullen, Louis Bennett, of course, who was the head of the IWW, as well as many members of Cumann na mBan and the Old Irish Citizen Army, middle-class women and working-class women. Many of the women who had been involved in what Countess Markievicz had said were the 3 great causes of Ireland: women, Ireland itself, and women workers. And now they come back to fight against the 37 Constitution. Indeed, Margaret Skinner, whose biography I recently published, had written to her friend and comrade Hannah Shea Skeffington and said that a good live women's organisation is what is needed to combat the diminishing of women's rights. And in many ways, the women's groups who came together to oppose the articles in the Constitution were that good live women's organisation, as they had been fighting against women's rights since early days of suffrage, looking for access to the third level for the rights of women's workers, etc. They were well versed in organisational skills. They immediately decide, the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Work, to appoint an emergency committee to publicise the issues relating to women arising from the draft constitution, and to work with other groups to delete the offending articles and to restore the free state constitution, which is just said, without distinction of sex, equal rights and equal opportunities. On the 1st of May 1937, the National University Women Graduates organised a meeting where the concerns about the threats to women's equal citizenship and women's franchise and women's place in society and the workplace were discussed. It was felt that these articles would regulate women to the domestic and exclude them from most employment. And these are some of the things that the women said. Permanent inferiority, their avocations and choice of callings limited because of an implied invalidism as a weaker sex from Hannah Shea Skeffington, a betrayal of the promises of 1916 from Senator Kathleen Clark, who later goes on to be the first woman Lord Mayor of Dublin, of course. All Cumann were particularly incensed about the inadequate strength of women in the Article 45. Where they wondered was the worry about the inadequate strength of women when women were engaged in the heavy muscular toil conveying machine guns, heavy explosives and rifles during the War of Independence. Kathleen Lynn wrote in her diary, the Irish Catholic says the Constitution is a noble document. That damns it, if nothing else. Louis Bennett of the Irish Women Workers' Union said the Constitution is hardly a place for the expression of vague and chivalrous sentiments. Mothers would prefer concrete proposals, which would release them from the pressure of economic necessity to work outside the home. Indeed, you could say that today, perhaps, about how care is regarded by government legislation. Margaret Buckley, president of Sinn Féin, in fact, the first woman president, observed that no one took the new constitution seriously, but if she was to take it seriously, she'd have something to say of the way in which De Valera treated women as if they were half-wits. And a supporter of De Valera, Dorothy McArdle, who'd been his comrade and friend, went against him on the Constitution. She said, as the Constitution stands, I do not see how anyone holding advanced views on the rights of women can support it, that it is a tragic dilemma for those who have been loyal and ardent workers in the national cause. And Professor Mary Hayden, in my favourite quote, said it was a mixture of flattery and insult. And so all of these women were very upset about it. Here's a quote from Kathleen O'Callaghan, former TD, member of Cumann, who'd seen her husband, the Lord Mayor of Cork, Michael O'Callaghan, murdered by the Black and Tans during the Revolutionary War. She'd been on the anti-treaty side with De Valera and indeed had been a friend and supporter of De Valera. She said the status of women were a great disappointment to me, as they have been to many who hope for equal rights and equal opportunities. I would ask you to delete these clauses because they are a betrayal of what was regarded by all loyal Irish women as a charter for their freedom. In the period of war with England, 1916 to 23, the Irish nation rose to the test as never before, men and women serving alike. There was no talk then of inadequate strength of women, of their differences of capacity, physical and moral, and of social function. And I'm surprised that you, who lived through this period in intimate contact with ordinary people of the nation and valued the splendid service of women, now include in this draft constitution clauses which, however well-intentioned, will militate against women in a state based on their work and sacrifice. The women involved, however, in the campaign were small. Feminist activism had become really associated with urban women in many ways. After the Civil War, a lot of women who had been involved in Cumann had simply gone back into the home. They were young, they were getting married, they were having families. They did, however, Here are a couple of more quotes. You'll be able to see them. I'll put up the PowerPoint. And here's an article, or leaflet from the National University Women's Graduate Association that they issued. So they really went all out to combat the women in the home articles. Said under Article 41, the state can interfere in the private concerns of the home. Under Article 45, the state can interfere in women's choice of occupation. Under Article 40, your equality of status guaranteed in the 1916 proclamation is taken away. Vote against this constitution. There was, of course, a backlash against the women. McCullough has written that John Charles McQuaid urged De Valera to hold fast. Can you, sorry? The feminists are getting angry. They seem stung by the suggestion that the normal place of women is in the home. De Valera was actually bewildered by the opposition because he thought he was friends with many of these feminists. As Katrina Clear wrote, his irritation at feminist opposition suggests that he did not inhabit a political environment that was entirely indifferent to women's views. He told Professor T.P. O'Neill that Ivy Pinchbeck's Women Workers in the Industrial Revolution had had a major impact on his thinking and forced his attention onto protecting women and children from the worst effects of the Industrial Revolution. The fact that De Valera felt the need to invoke a feminist authority for his reference to women in the Constitution is, as Clear says, significant. He did take out the inadequate strength of women article, and that satisfied the Irish Women Workers Union. And unfortunately, at that stage, they withdrew from the campaign, as did Old Cumann Amon. That meant the campaign was severely weakened. So despite a well-run, short, intense, and highly publicised campaign, there was no real impact made on the majority of Irish women. The Constitution was accepted by a majority, 685,105 votes to 526,945 votes, which actually wasn't huge considering they were a very small group, and they obviously did make some impact, but they were going up against a very conservative revolutionaries government, a very conservative state, very conservative church, and a society that just wanted peace in many ways. As a result, church and state were united in declaring that homework for women was part of the natural order, an ideal to be attained by the majority of women. So what are the legacies after this in the immediate aftermath? Well, in 1937, the Women's Social and Political League was founded. In a response, Dorothy McCardle, she said she felt the body was a necessity, and she never before thought that such a necessity would arise in Ireland. It has arisen because men had organised the sexes separately to the detriment of women. By 1943, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, when running unsuccessfully for the Dáil, said, Irish women were given equal citizenship and equal rights and equal opportunities, but subsequent legislation and the 37 Constitution had rendered the promises of equality in the proclamation an empty formula and meaningless. From then on in, feminist activism would centre on mainly organisations like the Housewives Association and the ICA, who, while keeping women's activism alive, focused its activism on addressing women's domestic concerns. Housewives trying to feed and clothe their families, high prices, put pressure on the government to introduce price controls and guaranteed supplies and legacies for all citizens. So although its meaning and attempt was eroded in the 1920s and 30s, the promise of the 1916 proclamation of equal citizenship for men and women should be remembered. The degree to which later politicians deviated from its spirit is evident in the distinction between the Constitution of 22, which enshrined that status, and the Constitution of 37, which rejected it. As Carol Coulter suggests, these articles, the Women in the Home articles in the Constitution, the accompanying legislation and the spirit it embodied, militated heavily against involvement of women in public life. And I leave the last word to the great historian and feminist scholar, Margaret McCurtain, who sadly passed away earlier this year. In talking about the 1937 Constitution, she said, "The position of women in the Irish Constitution is value-laden. I think it really comes from the central position that the Catholic Church occupies in the Irish Free State and the perception of women in Catholic culture and political life. And this very often happens in a country that has undergone a revolution followed by a civil war, that strong currents regulating the life of the country go towards a desire for conservative behaviour and conservative images of women. And that value-laden position for women remains in our constitution to this day, a situation that demands, I would argue, change. I myself favour deletion, following on from the great feminist activists who opposed its insertion, and rightfully, I would argue, see these articles as a entrenchment of the position of second-class citizenship for women in Ireland. Thank you for listening.
Wow, that I think I'm not alone here in saying blown away by obviously your delivery, Mary, but also encouraged that our reaction, well, my reaction certainly to this provision is in many ways shared by the commentators, the women of 1937, that this wasn't simply something that was just the prevailing wisdom of the time,
I have my dinner, just one is.
Sorry, I have myself on mute there. I'm blown away basically by the fact that we are not alone in our reaction to this provision, in today's world, that the reaction of women at the time, I think it's really instructive to look back and see that the people of the time, it's not just of the time. It was as offensive then as it is now to people reading it. I'm finding it very instructive.